Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharmasvarupine avatara varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. Most of you who are watching this lecture are very likely devotees of Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, and Swami Vivekananda. One thing I've noticed, I've been in the order for now a little over 11 years, and what I've noticed is that very few devotees of Sri Ramakrishna have read or studied the works of Sri Aurobindo. And I think it's a shame. So what I want to make a case today that Sri Aurobindo belongs to the same spiritual lineage as Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. That's number one. And number two, I want to show that devotees of Sri Ramakrishna can also benefit greatly from studying the life and teachings of Sri Aurobindo. So Sri Aurobindo was born in 1872, which was just 9 years after Swami Vivekananda was born. But he spent his childhood and he was educated also in England. And then he came back in his 20s to India. And when he came back to India, he was involved in the independence movement. He was a freedom fighter for a few years until he had a spiritual awakening. And I'll mention a bit later that Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda played a crucial role in his spiritual awakening. And after that spiritual awakening, for the rest of his life, he became a great yogi, a realized soul, and he started his own ashrama in Pondicherry. So what I want to discuss today, I want to discuss two things. Number one, how exactly was Sri Aurobindo influenced by Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, and what did he have to say about them? And number two, how can we, as devotees in the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition, how can we benefit from studying his life and teachings? So the first point, how was Sri Aurobindo influenced by Thakur and Swamiji? I want to read to you a few statements he made. So the first one is from a 1913 letter. He writes this to a disciple. He says, "Remember also that we derive from Ramakrishna. For myself, it was Ramakrishna who personally came and first turned me to this yoga." It's a very interesting statement. Sri Ramakrishna, of course, left his body in 1886. How is it that Sri Aurobindo is saying it was Sri Ramakrishna who came and turned me to this yoga? What Sri Aurobindo means is that on a mystical plane, Sri Ramakrishna actually communicated with Sri Aurobindo. And not just once, but on 3 different occasions. And Sri Aurobindo actually mentions that in several diary entries. He says that Sri Ramakrishna came to him and spoke to him 3 times. And the first time, he said in Bangla, he said, "Aurobindo, mundir koro, mundir koro." Aurobindo, start an ashrama, start a mandira. And he gave 2 other messages to Sri Aurobindo. And as I just noted, Sri Aurobindo himself states that it was Sri Ramakrishna who first turned him on the spiritual path and taught him about his own integral yoga. Now, what about Swami Vivekananda? So to understand Swami Vivekananda's influence, we should remember that Sri Aurobindo was a freedom fighter in his early days when he first came to India. And because of his political activities, he was actually imprisoned in a jail in Kolkata, the Alipur jail, for 1 year. During that year, Sri Aurobindo himself says that Swami Vivekananda directly communicated with him. I'll read directly what Sri Aurobindo said. So by the way, Sri Aurobindo was imprisoned in 1908. And he says, "Vivekananda in the Alipur jail gave me the foundations of that knowledge, which is the basis of our sadhana, of our spiritual practice." So here Sri Aurobindo is clearly stating that Swami Vivekananda came to Sri Aurobindo in his jail cell and taught him about yoga and meditation. And in another place, Sri Aurobindo says this, "It is a fact that I was hearing constantly the voice of Vivekananda speaking to me for a fortnight. Fortnight means for 2 weeks. In the jail, in my solitary meditation, and felt his presence. The voice spoke only on a special and limited but very important field of spiritual experience, and it ceased as soon as it had finished saying all that it had to say on that subject." And so it's very interesting that Sri Aurobindo was not just intellectually influenced by Sri Ramakrishna's teachings or Swamiji's teachings. He was directly he directly communicated with both Thakur and Swamiji. That's something I wanted to emphasize. He also made some really remarkable statements about Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji. So I want to read some of them. In an essay that Sri Aurobindo wrote called The Brain of India, he discussed many of the great giants in Indian history. And he compares them. And I want to read one passage from this essay, The Brain of India, where he compares Kalidasa, the great poet, Shankara, the great philosopher, and Sri Ramakrishna. So he says, the original achievement of a Kalidasa, accomplishing the highest in every line of poetic creation, is so incredible to the European mind that it has been sought to cleave that mighty master of harmonies into a committee of three. This is a joking way of saying that Western scholars are so amazed by Kalidasa's achievement, all the many things that he wrote, that many European scholars think that it was actually three different people. That later Indian people said that this one person, Kalidasa, wrote all of them, but European scholars don't believe it because it's too massive an achievement. That's what Sri Aurobindo is saying in a joking way. Then Sri Aurobindo continues. He says, yet it is paralleled by the accomplishment in philosophy of Shankara in a short life of 32 years, and dwarfed by the universal mastery of all possible spiritual knowledge and experience of Sri Ramakrishna in our own era. So compared to all the other past giants in India's history, he says Sri Ramakrishna dwarfs them all in his universal mastery of all possible spiritual knowledge and experience. And in another essay, we all know that Swami Vivekananda called Sri Ramakrishna Avatara Varishta in his famous Pranama mantra. And Swamiji hints at why. He explains in the same Pranama mantra, because he is Sarva Dharma Swarupine. He is the essence of all dharmas. Sri Aurobindo, many people don't know that Sri Aurobindo says the same thing, but explains in more detail why Sri Ramakrishna was the Avatara Varishta. So this is what Sri Aurobindo says. He says, Sri Ramakrishna was the last and greatest of all of the avatars, for while other avatars felt God in a single or limited aspect, he, Sri Ramakrishna, felt God in his illimitable unity as the sum of an illimitable variety. In him, in Sri Ramakrishna, the spiritual experiences of the millions of saints who had gone before were renewed and united. So Sri Aurobindo, like Swamiji, explains that Sri Ramakrishna was the Avatara Varishta, the greatest of avatars, because he realized God in so many different aspects, which was unprecedented, even among previous avatars. Now, another very, very important aspect of Sri Aurobindo's greatness is that he was not just a great scholar, he was a great yogi and a realized soul. And there are also very striking parallels between the kind of spiritual experiences that Sri Aurobindo had and the kind of spiritual experiences that Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji talked about and also experienced. So I want to just give some taste of that. So in 1908, Sri Aurobindo was in Baroda in India, and he was under training with a yogi named Vishnu Bhaskar Lele. And Lele was teaching him about some devotional techniques, some meditative techniques, and then Sri Aurobindo went into a deep meditation. But instead of realizing the personal God, very surprisingly, he had an experience of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, which is the Advaitic experience of merging your individuality in the non-dual Brahman. So he says that in 1908, at this time, his first spiritual experience, he says he had a series of tremendously powerful experiences which made him see with a stupendous intensity the world as a cinematographic play of vacant forms in the impersonal universality of the absolute Brahman. Basically, this is the Advaitic experience of Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. He realized that he is one with this impersonal, non-dual reality, and that everything else felt somehow unreal. That was his first spiritual experience. Now, if you've studied the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, what does that remind you of? Sri Ramakrishna very frequently distinguishes two stages of spiritual experience, jnana and vijnana. And this corresponds to the jnana stage. Sri Ramakrishna says jnana means after you climb up to the roof, after doing neti sadhana, you attain nirvikalpa samadhi and you merge with Brahman and you feel that this world is unreal. But then Sri Ramakrishna says, after attaining jnana, after attaining nirvikalpa samadhi, some souls, Ishvara kotis, divinely commissioned souls, can come back to this relative plane. They can come back down the same stairs. And they realize two things. They realize that the ultimate reality is not only impersonal, but is also personal. Jini nirgun tini shogun. It's both nirguna and saguna. And number two, the Vijnani realizes that Brahman has become everything in this world. Brahman has become the 24 cosmic principles. And so I already mentioned that Sri Aurobindo's first spiritual experience in 1908 was basically what Sri Ramakrishna calls jnana, Advaitik Nirvikalpa Samadhi. Just 1 year later, not even 1 year, within 1 year, when he was in jail. I just mentioned that Swamiji came and visited him for 2 weeks in jail. At that time, Sri Aurobindo also had the experience of Vijnana, what Thakur calls Vijnana, and he explains it in beautiful detail. He says this, Sri Aurobindo says, I looked at the jail that secluded me from men, and it was no longer by its high walls that I was imprisoned. No, it was Vasudeva who surrounded me. I walked under the branches of the tree in front of my cell, but it was not the tree. I knew it was Vasudeva. It was Sri Krishna whom I saw standing there and holding over me his shade. I looked at the bars of my cell, the very grating that did duty for a door, and again I saw Vasudeva. It was Narayana who was guarding and standing sentry over me. Or I lay on the coarse blankets that were given me for a couch and felt the arms of Sri Krishna around me, the arms of my friend and lover. This was the first use of the deeper vision Bhagavan Krishna gave me. I looked at the prisoners in the jail, the thieves, the murderers, the swindlers, and as I looked at them, I saw Vasudeva. It was Narayana whom I found in these darkened souls and misused bodies. It's very, very eloquent and beautiful. He's explaining that in this jail cell, he had the experience of Vijnana. He had the experience of seeing God in absolutely everything and everyone around. In his own jail cell, the guards, the prisoners, everything was Narayana, everything was Vasudeva. Now, that was the first part. How did Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji influence Sri Aurobindo? And what did Sri Aurobindo say about these two great spiritual giants? Now the second point, and I want to conclude with this. How can we benefit, as devotees of Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji, how can we benefit from studying the life and teachings of Sri Aurobindo? I don't have much time, but I'll just mention 2 points. Number one, it helps us better understand the Vedantic scriptures, especially the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. Swami Vivekananda, he said on many occasions, he said, no one can truly understand the Vedas and Vedanta unless one studies them in the light of the utterance of Sri Ramakrishna. This is what Swami Vivekananda said. Now, unfortunately, Swami Vivekananda himself left his body very young, at the age of 39 in 1902. So he didn't have enough time to write Prasthanatraya Bhashyas himself. We don't have full-length commentaries on the Upanishads or on the Bhagavad Gita or on the Brahma Sutra from the standpoint of the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition. And unfortunately, even more unfortunately, even though it's been 100 years, more than 100 years, none of the monks of the Ramakrishna order have yet come out with these commentaries on the Vedantic scriptures. However, Sri Aurobindo has started the work that Swami Vivekananda wanted us to do. And I want to explain that. So, first of all, this is what Sri Aurobindo himself said about how we should study the Vedantic scriptures. He says this, Sri Aurobindo, the word Vedanta is usually identified with the strict monism and the peculiar theory of Maya, established by the lofty and ascetic intellect of Shankara. But it is the Upanishads themselves and not Shankara's writings, the text and not the commentary, that are the authoritative scripture of the Vedantin. Shankara's, great and temporarily satisfying as it was, is still only one synthesis and interpretation of the Upanishads. There have been others in the past which have powerfully influenced the national mind, and there is no reason why there should not be a yet more perfect synthesis in the future. It is such a synthesis, embracing all life and action in its scope, that the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and Vivekananda have been preparing. So in this beautiful statement, Sri Aurobindo says, number one, we should not, when we try to understand the Vedantic scriptures, we should not rely on Shankara or any of the traditional commentators. Now that Sri Ramakrishna has come, our duty is to reinterpret these great Vedantic scriptures in the non-sectarian and harmonizing spirit of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. And Sri Aurobindo himself wrote some wonderful full-length commentaries on the Vedantic scriptures. He wrote what's called the Essays on the Gita. which is a 600-page commentary on the Bhagavad Gita in English. And I believe it's a hidden treasure for devotees of Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji and people who want to have a deeper understanding of the Vedantic scriptures. Because Sri Aurobindo was not just a brilliant scholar, but he was a realized soul. So he was explaining the shlokas of the Gita based on his own spiritual experiences and in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. I don't have enough time to explain this, but just to give you one brief example. In several places in the Bhagavad Gita, including in chapter 7, shloka 2, and chapter 9, shloka 1, Bhagavan Krishna talks about jnana and vijnana. He uses the Sanskrit terms jnana and vijnana. And these are very mysterious terms because Bhagavan Krishna himself does not directly define the terms. So different commentators, different readers have interpreted these terms in different ways. Shankara's interpretation is the most common. Shankara says jnana in the Gita means intellectual knowledge of Atman. And vijnana means spiritual realization of that Atman. So it's a difference between intellectual knowledge and anubhuti. Most people accept Shankara's interpretation. What Sri Aurobindo does is he reinterprets, he gives a new interpretation to the terms jnana and vijnana in the Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on jnana and vijnana. So he interprets jnana in the Gita as this advaitic knowledge of non-dual Brahman, and vijnana as what he calls the integral or comprehensive knowledge of the impersonal, personal Purushottama. And he beautifully shows how this understanding of jnana and vijnana best fits with the overall meaning of all of the other shlokas in the Gita. So he gives a contextual justification for understanding jnana and vijnana in this way with regard to the Gita. So that's just one brief example of how Sri Aurobindo has interpreted the entire Bhagavad Gita in the spirit of Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji. And the other final thing I wanted to mention is that Sri Aurobindo, he wrote a lot of very dense philosophical works like The Life Divine and The Synthesis of Yoga, but he also wrote a huge number of letters to his disciples. His disciples in the Pondicherry Ashrama had many, many questions, very ordinary questions about spiritual life, about their struggles, and he gave beautiful, very simple answers in very plain English. And they're contained in 4 volumes called Letters on Yoga, volumes 1, volume 2, volume 3, and volume 4. And I would recommend, actually, if you haven't studied Sri Aurobindo before, these are very good texts to start with, because they're very, very practical. They're like a manual for spiritual practice. So if you have doubts about your spiritual progress, doubts about the existence of God, if you're wondering how you can get rid of the lower impulses of lust and greed, kama, krodha, lobha, if you want to know about the different stages in developing bhakti toward God, if you want to know about how to cultivate vyakulata, yearning or longing for God, if you want to know how you can maintain an awareness of the divine, even in the midst of our day-to-day activities, Sri Aurobindo has answers to all of these questions in Letters on Yoga in a very, very practical way. And he also talks about how the first stage in our spiritual experience is what Sri Aurobindo calls psychic awakening. So he says that before we have any realization of God, we must realize that we are not the body and we are not the mind, but that we are actually the eternal soul, deep in our hearts, what he called the psychic being. In Sanskrit, he called it the Chaitya Purusha. Chaitya comes from the word chit, which means divine consciousness. So he says that this soul within us is actually a portion of the divine. And our first aim in spiritual life is to realize that we are that soul. And only then can we have true bhakti for God. And I just want to show how that tallies perfectly with what Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji says. Sri Ramakrishna says in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, June 8, 1883, Sri Ramakrishna says, with ordinary people, the mind dwells on the lower 3 planes, at the organs of evacuation and generation, and at the navel, guhya, nabi, and linga. When the mind ascends to the 4th plane, the center designated in yoga as anahata, it sees the individual soul as a flame, the jivatma. Besides, it sees light. At this, the aspirant cries, ah, what is this? Ah, what is this? So Sri Ramakrishna explains exactly in the same way that the first spiritual experience of sadhakas is when their mind reaches the 4th plane and they realize that they are the jivatma, the eternal soul, and not the body or the mind. And Swamiji, Swami Vivekananda, in one place, he was asked, Swamiji, how can one have bhakti? And he gave a very beautiful answer, which also tallies with exactly what Sri Aurobindo says. He says, there is bhakti within you. Only a veil of lust and wealth, kamini kanchana, kama kanchana, covers that bhakti. And as soon as that is removed, that veil is removed, bhakti will manifest by itself. So what Swamiji is saying is just a different way of saying the same thing. Each of us is already a bhakta, but we have to realize that inner bhakta within us by removing this veil of lust and greed. So with that, let us pray to Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother Sharada Devi, Swami Vivekananda, and Sri Aurobindo, another great spiritual son of Sri Ramakrishna, to bless us so that we can all attain psychic awakening and God realization in this very life. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.